Hello, philosophy students. This is a lecture on free will and Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism. I'm guessing this will be the first of two lectures. I can't imagine I can cover it all in one. I'm using these two videos for both my Introduction to Philosophy class and my ethics class because we talk about Sartre at the end of both of those classes. So hopefully you've seen a video about determinism. So determinists, of course, claim that all human behaviors are caused. They really don't think there's much difference ultimately between human behaviors and other events of the natural world. Probably the only difference is that the causes of human behaviors are going to be incredibly complex, very complicated, that it may be even difficult to discern exactly what all of those causes are. But nevertheless, they think that human beings ultimately are caused to do what they do just as much as events in the natural world are. A hard determinist is someone who thinks that because we could never have made a choice other than the one that we actually make, that we are also not morally responsible for our actions. What's called a soft determinist thinks that although our actions are caused, that's not what matters. The question is whether they're compelled and by outside forces. And if they are, then those actions are not free and we're not responsible. But if they're not compelled, then we are free and we are responsible for those choices. The other position on the free will issue is known as the libertarian position, also known as the free will issue, or free will position, I should say. The minimum requirement for being a free will advocate is that you deny that all human behaviors are caused. So if you think, for example, that some behaviors are caused, but just not all of them, then we would put you into the free will or libertarian camp. Because determinists think that all human behaviors are caused. Jean-Paul Sartre, our last philosopher of the semester, represents the extreme opposite view from determinism. He is an extreme libertarian because he does not believe that human behaviors are ever caused. He thinks that that's really just a fundamental mistake about the nature of being human. So from the determinist perspective, one way of thinking of the determinist argument is that they're essentially saying, why should we think that what's true for everything else in the universe, as far as we know, isn't also true for human beings? What makes us so special? Isn't it just make a lot more sense to think that 100% of the events in the universe are caused by previous events? And if that applies to everything else, why shouldn't it apply to human beings as well? So determinists really think that human beings are not really all that different than everything else. Determinists are often what we call materialists. They believe everything is physical, everything is made out of physical matter, and they typically think that's true of human beings just like everything else. So libertarians want to argue against that. And from Jean-Paul Sartre's perspective, the fact that human beings can think and are conscious beings is a reason for thinking that what applies to the rest of the natural world doesn't necessarily apply to us. So one of the reasons why, if I hold an object like this pen and I let it go, surprise, surprise, and it falls, one of the reasons why that's true for the pen is that the pen can't conceive of the possibility of doing anything else. A pen is not a thinking thing. It is incapable of consciously making purposeful decisions. On the other hand, human beings are conscious. We can think, which makes us different as far as we know from everything else in the universe. So what's true for planets and trees and ink pens and everything else that we've come across in the universe, it might make sense that determinism applies to all of those things. But none of those things can think. None of those things are conscious. So I can think, for example, of making different choices right in the future. So when I think about this summer, I can think about spending my summer out in some of the parks or going on a vacation trip, or I can imagine myself continuing to teach. Um, I can think of a variety of things, right? I might go into another profession, um, leave OCC, maybe go teach somewhere else. I can think of a variety of different options. And to someone like Sartre, that's reason for thinking that we're not like things. We are not like objects. I can imagine myself going in various directions in the future, making different choices, whereas things like pens can't. So with determinists like de Holbach or other determinists might think of as a rhetorical question, why should we think that we're different than anything else that exists? Sartre says there is reason for thinking that humans are different than other things, and that is that we can think, that we have the possibility of making different choices. So Sartre represents, like I said, the extreme opposite view of determinists. Now, some people take a more middle of the road position. Maybe that some human behaviors are free and others are caused. But it's difficult to imagine why that would be true. So, for example, if I say that some of my actions are determined, but others are free, well, what exactly makes for a free choice that it would be different than other caused choices that I make? So, for example, if my decision to wear my orange shirt today was determined by whatever causes led to it, but my choice to have breakfast cereal this morning was free, why was that a free action? What makes it different than, right, the decision to wear the orange shirt, which was determined? So it's difficult in some respects to see why some people would be freer than others, why some actions would be freer than others. Some people think free will is an all or nothing game. Either human beings have freedom or they don't, and if we do, then it's complete. And that's the perspective of Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre is a 20th century French philosopher. Not only a major figure in philosophy, but also in literature, along with works of philosophy. He also wrote works of literature. He wrote plays. His most famous is probably called No Exit. He wrote novels. Existentialism, as his philosophy, really lends itself to being displayed through examples of human lives. And so it made sense, I think, for him to write some of his philosophy down in the form of literature. He actually won a Nobel Prize for Literature in the 1960s, which he refused to accept as a protest against American and French involvement in Vietnam. He was closely associated with a couple of other people. Albert Camus, who some of you may know, an Algerian writer. He wrote The Myth of Sisyphus and the Stranger, a couple of existentialist works. They were close friends until they had kind of a falling out, and they were not speaking, I don't believe, when Camus was killed in an automobile accident in the 50s. Sartre was also very close with a female philosopher, Simone de Beauvoir. They had kind of a complicated French intellectual relationship. They were a couple, but they weren't a couple. They didn't want to get in the way of each other's freedom, but anyway. So Sartre believes that the very root of human existence, we are free. So one of the things we're going to try to do is understand what Sartre thinks of as being the implications of having the kind of free will that he talks about. So I'm going to talk about 6 different basic themes of Sartre's philosophy. And the first one is what Sartre refers to as radical freedom. So the word radical means to go to the root of. So if you think about in mathematics, if you take a square root, it's also called a radical. So the radical of 25 is 5, which is the square root of 25. So the word radical means to go to the root of. So Sartre believes because we are conscious thinking beings, at the very root of our existence, we are free. We can think about making different choices. We can form intent. which objects cannot do. So he thinks at the very root of our existence, we have a kind of freedom that objects do not have. So again, unlike the determinists who think all behaviors are caused, Sartre doesn't believe that any human behaviors are caused. So this is a pretty radical position. Not only does Sartre believe that humans are radically free, but a second basic idea of his existentialist philosophy is that he thinks that we have what he calls radical responsibility. So unlike the determinists who think ultimately because our behaviors are caused and we couldn't have done anything else, at least hard determinists, and so we are not responsible for our behaviors, because Sartre believes we do have freedom, we then become completely responsible for all of the choices that we make. So from Sartre's perspective, whenever we make a choice, we alone are completely responsible for that choice. So I'll give you an example. Suppose, as I think all of you know, I have very little artistic ability. And somebody says to me, so, Mr. Eisenhart, why do you think you can't draw very well? Why do you don't have any artistic ability? And I say something like, well, my parents never encouraged me. Whenever I'd bring art home from school, they would always denigrate it or claim I was wasting my time. And so I ended up not developing whatever artistic abilities that I had. And if only they'd encouraged me more, maybe I would be more artistic today. But to Sartre, that is profoundly not taking responsibility for my choices. From Sartre's perspective, even if my parents said things like that to me, I choose how to interpret it. So I may take it as a reason. I may choose to take it as a reason for not developing my artistic ability. But of course, I could, choose to interpret it as a reason for working on my art even more. So I could say to myself, well, someday I'll show my parents this is not a waste of time, that this is something that is profoundly important and valuable, and come back to them later and say, look, I know you didn't think I should be pursuing art, but look at these things I've made, these things I've created. So whether I choose to listen to my parents' advice is completely up to me. And so I become responsible for all of the choices that I make in my life. So I'm going to end things here and record a second video, which I will be posting as well.